The engines died at 31,000 feet, and for 4 seconds nobody in the cabin made a single sound. Then the screaming started. Marcus Webb felt his stomach lift into his throat as the private jet lurched sideways, the low hum that had lulled him into a business-class doze suddenly replaced by a silence so total it felt like the world had been switched off. He was the CEO of Webb Halloran Industries, a man who had negotiated billion-dollar mergers without breaking a sweat, and yet in that moment, strapped into a leather seat $40,000 couldn't protect him from. He understood for the first time in his life what true helplessness felt like. Across the aisle, a quiet man named Theo Marsh set down the paperback he'd been reading, calmly reached up, and unbuckled his seatbelt. If you believe in second chances, in the idea that the quietest people in the room are sometimes carrying the most extraordinary gifts, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Wisdom Story House, because what happens next will remind you why kindness and courage still matter in this world. Theo Marsh was not supposed to be on that flight. He'd been hired 3 days earlier as a last-minute logistics coordinator for Webb Halloran's Denver office relocation, a single father of an 8-year-old girl named Ruby who called him the quiet one at every job he'd ever worked, because Theo rarely spoke unless he had something worth saying. He'd taken the assignment because it paid enough to cover Ruby's tuition at the small private school that specialized in helping kids with her particular kind of dyslexia, the kind that made letters swim and numbers dance until she wanted to give up entirely. Theo never gave up on anything, especially not his daughter, and that stubborn refusal to quit was the only inheritance his own father, an Air Force pilot who died when Theo was 19, had left him besides a logbook and a pair of aviator sunglasses Theo still kept in his glove compartment. What none of the executives on that jet knew, what Marcus Webb certainly didn't know as he sat frozen in seat 2A watching the altitude indicator spiral downward, was that Theo Marsh had spent 4 years of his life in the cockpit of Air Force cargo planes before an injury grounded him for good. He hadn't flown in 11 years. He hadn't told anyone at Webb Halloran because nobody had asked, and Theo had learned a long time ago that some parts of yourself you keep folded away until the world needs them. The world needed them now. The co-pilot, a young man named Ashford Cole, staggered out of the cockpit with blood running from a gash above his eyebrow, screaming that the captain was unconscious and both engines had flamed out after what looked like a catastrophic bird strike, and that he'd never trained for a dual-engine failure at cruising altitude. He'd only ever simulated single-engine scenarios, and the aircraft was descending faster than any of his training had prepared him for. Panic spread through the cabin like wildfire. A junior analyst named Priya Chandrasekaran began sobbing into her hands. An older board member named Desmond Ruiz was praying in a language Marcus didn't recognize, his lips moving rapidly, his rosary beads clicking together with the shuddering of the plane. Marcus Webb, the man who ran meetings like a general commanding troops, who had once fired an entire department without blinking, found he could not move. He stared at the oxygen mask dangling in front of his face and thought, absurdly, of his ex-wife, of the daughter he hadn't called in 3 weeks because he'd been too buried in a merger to remember her birthday, of all the things he'd built that suddenly felt like nothing at all against the roaring wind outside the windows. That was when Theo Marsh stood up. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. There was something in the way he moved, deliberate and unhurried despite the chaos, that made people instinctively quiet down and look at him. He walked to the cockpit door, placed a steady hand on Ashford Cole's shoulder, and said only 4 words, "I've flown before." "Move." Ashford, 19 years old and drowning in terror, didn't argue. He scrambled aside, and Theo Marsh slid into the captain's seat beside the unconscious pilot, his hands finding the yoke like they'd never left it, like 11 years hadn't passed at all, like the muscle memory carved into him by his father's patient lessons and 4 years of military flying had simply been waiting, dormant, for this exact moment. Marcus Webb, unable to stay in his seat any longer, unbuckled and stumbled toward the cockpit doorway, gripping the frame as the plane shuddered violently around him. He watched this quiet, unassuming man he'd barely acknowledged during 3 days of working together transform into someone entirely different, eyes scanning instruments with fierce concentration, voice calm and low as he radioed air traffic control, requesting an emergency descent path toward the nearest airfield, a small regional strip called Larkspur Municipal that Theo somehow knew existed because he'd studied these mountain routes years ago and some stubborn part of his brain had never let the knowledge go. The plane was a glider now, no thrust, only gravity and the desperate mathematics of altitude versus distance, and Theo Marsh was doing that math in his head faster than any computer, adjusting the flaps, fighting to keep the nose level, fighting against a decade of rust and the trembling of his own hands, which he refused to let anyone see. Because underneath that calm exterior, Theo was terrified too. He kept thinking of Ruby, of her gap-toothed smile when she finally sounded out a difficult word on her own, of the promise he'd made her the morning he left for this trip, that he would be home by Friday to watch her spelling bee, the first one she'd ever worked up the courage to enter. He was not going to break that promise. Not today. Marcus Webb, watching from the doorway, felt something shift inside his own chest, some hardened, calcified part of himself cracking open. He had spent 15 years believing that value was measured in titles, in corner offices, in how loudly a person's success could be broadcast to the world. But here was a man he'd overlooked entirely, a coordinator he'd probably never have learned the name of if not for this catastrophe, quietly holding the lives of 11 people in his two steady hands, asking for no recognition, no reward, driven by nothing but love for a little girl waiting for him at home. The descent felt endless. Mountains rose sharply on either side as Theo threaded the powerless aircraft through a narrow valley, fighting crosswinds that wanted to slam them into granite walls, his jaw tight, sweat soaking through his shirt, murmuring under his breath, not prayers exactly, but something close to them, promises to Ruby, apologies to his late father, whispered coordinates and airspeed calculations all tangled together. Ashford Cole sat beside him now, reading altimeter numbers aloud in a shaking voice, becoming Theo's second set of eyes, and somewhere in that shared terror, the two of them became a crew. Larkspur Municipal appeared like a mirage, a strip of gray asphalt cutting through green pine forest, and Theo Marsh brought the crippled jet down in a long, screaming glide, no power, no margin for error, just instinct and 11 years of buried skill and a father's voice somewhere in his memory saying, "Easy, easy, let her settle." The wheels touched down hard, bounced once, and then the aircraft was rolling, shuddering, finally slowing to a stop just short of the tree line, and the cabin erupted not in screams this time but in sobbing, disbelieving laughter, the sound of people realizing they were going to live. Marcus Webb was the first one into the cockpit afterward. He found Theo Marsh sitting motionless in the captain's seat, hands still trembling on his lap, staring out at the pine trees with an expression that wasn't triumph, just quiet, exhausted relief. Marcus knelt beside him, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, this powerful man had no idea what to say. So he simply said thank you, and then he asked, voice cracking, who taught you to fly like that? Theo told him about his father. About Ruby. About the spelling bee he almost missed. 3 weeks later, Marcus Webb didn't just give Theo Marsh a promotion. He created an entire aviation safety division within Webb Halloran Industries and put Theo at the head of it, with a salary that meant Ruby would never have to worry about tuition again, and a schedule built entirely around never missing another spelling bee. Ruby won that competition, by the way, 3 weeks late but exactly on time in every way that mattered, her father sitting in the front row, aviator sunglasses tucked into his shirt pocket like a small, quiet piece of the man who'd taught him everything. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it reminded you that the quietest person in the room might be carrying something extraordinary inside them, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs a little faith today, because stories like Theo's are the reason this channel exists. Before you go, I have one small request. Type the word, courage, in the comments below if you believe love for our children can make us capable of anything, even miracles at 31,000 feet. Theo Marsh never called himself a hero. He simply said he had a promise to keep, and that some skills, like some kinds of love, never really leave us, no matter how long they've been quietly waiting.